Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Wizard and Glass by Stephen King. Now, Wizard and Glass was published in 1997, and this is the fourth book in Stephen King's epic fantasy series, The Dark Tower. The first three books in this series being The Gunslinger, which was published in 1982, The Drawing of the Three, which was published in 1987, and The Wastelands, which was published in 1991. Now, I'm currently rereading and reviewing all the Dark Tower novels in preparation for the new film adaptation of the Dark Tower series, which is set to come out this summer. Now, the basic plotline of the Dark Tower series overall is it's set primarily in this alternate universe known as Midworld, which is a world very different from our own. At the same time, though, it bears a lot of similarities to our world, and it's heavily implied that this world used to be a lot like our world thousands of years ago. And the series follows this man named Roland Deschain, who is the last gunslinger. Now, gunslingers in this world were basically this elite group of peacekeepers, and it was their job to maintain peace and order in Midworld, but there was a war years prior to the events of the first book that wiped out all the gunslingers with the exception of Roland, and throughout the series, Roland is looking for this thing called the Dark Tower, which actually holds the time-space continuum together. And throughout the series, Roland comes to understand that Midworld is just part of a long chain of parallel universes that are all held together by the Dark Tower. Now, throughout the first three Dark Tower novels, Roland ends up meeting these people who, from his point of view, are from an alternate universe, but are actually from our world. The first is this young boy named Jake Chambers from New York City. The second is this recovering heroin addict named Eddie Dean, who is also from New York City. The third is this wheelchair-bound African-American woman named Odetta Holmes, who later goes by the name Susanna, who is also from New York. And together, the four of them form what Roland calls a Ka-Tet, which is this tight-knit group of people brought together by destiny. Now, at a certain point in the third Dark Tower novel, The Wastelands, the Ka-Tet end up meeting this Billy Bumbler named Oi. Now, Billy Bumblers are these dog-like creatures that actually have limited speaking abilities, and Oi ends up joining the Ka-Tet, and despite the fact that he's not a human, he ends up proving himself to be a worthy addition to the Ka-Tet. Now, as the series went on, it was revealed that pretty much all of Stephen King's other books and short stories connect to the Dark Tower series in some way, shape, or form. Now, in my opinion, Wizard and Glass is by far the best book in the entire Dark Tower series. Now, I love the Dark Tower series overall, and I did like the Dark Tower novels that were written after this, but in my opinion, the series was never quite as good as this book. Like, in my opinion, this book is the pinnacle of how good the Dark Tower series can get. Like, to me, this is by far the best book in the entire series, and in my opinion, is one of Stephen King's best books. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this book is, essentially, it's a story within the story. The book itself is really an origin story for the character of Roland, and it talks about why Roland is the way he is, and why he's so obsessed with trying to find the Dark Tower. And then the wraparound story in this book is a direct sequel to The Wastelands, picking up right where The Wastelands left off. Now, this is going to sound like a criticism, but it really isn't, because I personally don't mind it at all, but one criticism that I could see somebody making is that Stephen King really should have taken the origin story for Roland and published it as its own novel, as sort of a Dark Tower prequel novel, and then Stephen King should have expanded upon the stuff that's taken place in present time and made that its own book. And I could see that criticism, but personally it worked for me. I loved how the story jumped back and forth from the stuff that's happening in present time of this story, and then it goes all the way into Roland's past, and the origin story for Roland in this book is actually a Romeo and Juliet-esque love story, and it's a very tragic love story, and in my opinion, it's one of the most well-written love stories I've ever read. Now, the plot of Wizard and Glass is it picks up right where The Wastelands left off. Now, The Wastelands ended on this huge cliffhanger where Roland, Eddie, Susanna, Jake, and Oy boarded onto this living train called Blaine, and Blaine was threatening to crash himself, killing them all unless they can beat him, and if they beat him, he will take them to their next destination. Now, I don't want to give away how the Ka-Tet beat Blaine, but the way they beat Blaine is actually pretty brilliant and actually really hilarious. But after they beat him, Blaine takes them to their next destination, which is actually not in Midworld. Blaine actually takes them out of Midworld and into another dimension. Now, this other dimension that they enter at first appears to be the world that Eddie, Susanna, and Jake are from. Keep in mind that Eddie and Susanna and Jake are from our world, so this world that they enter at first appears to be our world, but it isn't. At least it's not our world exactly. Now, the whole Dark Tower series deals with the concept of other dimensions and multiple universes, and the whole idea of this series is that there are hundreds, thousands, perhaps even millions of different universes, and each universe has its own version of planet Earth, and this version of Earth that they enter is not the same version of Earth that Eddie, Susanna, and Jake are from, nor is it the same version of Earth that some of Stephen King's other books like It, The Dead Zone, Pet Sematary, Misery, or The Green Mile take place on. It turns out that this version of Earth that they have entered has actually been wiped out by a virus, and they find this out because they see all these dead bodies everywhere, and they come across a newspaper clipping talking about a virus called Captain Trips. Now, of course, readers of Stephen King's books would realize that this universe that they have entered is actually the universe that Stephen King's post-apocalyptic novel The Stand took place in, and it's the same universe that his short story Night Surf took place in as well. Now, these parts of the book that take place in the world of The Stand do feature a lot of direct links to The Stand. For example, there's a certain point in this book where the Ka-Tet come across a note relating to Mother Abigail, who was a major character in The Stand, and as you can imagine, the Ka-Tet do eventually come face to face with Randall Flagg, who was the primary antagonist of The Stand. Now, of course, Randall Flagg has been in this series before under the guise of Walter O'Dim, or the Man in Black. However, at this point in the series, Roland doesn't yet realize that Randall Flagg and Walter O'Dim are actually the same person, but when Roland sees Flagg, he actually does recognize him as somebody from his past. It appears that Flagg has the ability to change his appearance, which is how he can appear as different people. Now, these sections of the book that take place in the world of The Stand are actually only a few sections of the book. As I said, most of this book is actually a story within the story, because there's a certain point in this book where, as the Ka-Tet are trying to figure out how to get back to Midworld, they decide to camp out at this old abandoned highway, and Roland ends up telling them a story about something that happened to him when he was a teenager, and that story that Roland tells them takes up most of this book. Now, this story within the story begins shortly after Roland first became a gunslinger. Now, in the first Dark Tower novel, you found out that Roland was actually one of the youngest people to ever become gunslingers when he was only 14 years old, and he took the test to become a gunslinger shortly after discovering that his mother was having an affair with a wizard named Martin Broadcloak, who actually served as an advisor to Roland's father, Stephen. So, fearing for Roland's life, Stephen ends up sending Roland and his two friends, Cuthbert and Allay, away from Gilead, which was Roland's home city, to this small town miles away from Gilead, where Stephen feels like Roland would be out of Martin's reach. And it is in this small town where Roland meets this young girl named Susan Delgado, with whom he falls in love with, and really this love story is the crux of the entire novel. And it is in this town where Roland and his friends discover a conspiracy among the people in power in this town. It turns out that some of the higher-ups in this town are actually in cahoots with a man named John Farson. Now, Farson is the one who started the war that would eventually wipe out all the gunslingers, with the exception of Roland, and they never actually call Farson this in the book, but he was essentially what you would call a terrorist. Like, they never actually call him that, but that was basically what he was. Like, he was trying to bring down all the governments in Midworld. And Farson's followers saw him as sort of like a revolutionary or a freedom fighter, but in reality he was essentially what you would call a terrorist. And once again, Roland and his friends discover that some of the higher-ups in this small town are actually in cahoots with John Farson. But while you have all this political intrigue going on, you also have this forbidden romance going on between Roland and Susan, and this really is a forbidden romance because they're not supposed to be together at all. I don't want to give away too much about what happens, but let's just say that Susan was already promised to somebody else, and Susan didn't entirely have a say in this, and really it comes down to that there were some really bad people in this town who were really kind of using Susan for their own personal means, but Roland and Susan end up falling in love, but this love, this romance that happens between them, also kind of leads to their downfall as well. But that's the basic plotline of the story within the story of Wizard and Glass. Now, as I said before, Wizard and Glass is an excellent book, and this is by far my favorite of the Dark Tower series. And I've already read the entire Dark Tower series, and once again, even though I did like the Dark Tower novels that were written after this, to me the series was never quite as good as this book. And I just think the book works so well as being simultaneously a continuation of the Dark Tower storyline, while also being a prequel, because once again, it's a story within the story, and I know the story within the story format might throw a lot of people off, but to me it worked. And also, as cheesy as it might sound, I actually thought the love story aspect of the book worked very well, and I actually thought was quite believable, and that could just be because Stephen King is such a good writer that it's so well written that it comes off as being more believable than maybe it should be. And you just feel so bad for Roland, and you could totally see what kind of drove Roland to become the hard ass that he is in present time of the Dark Tower storyline because of what happened to him in this town and because of what happened to Susan, this girl that he loved. But you especially feel bad for Susan, especially because before she met Roland, she was already promised to somebody else, but she didn't 100% have a say in this, and you just feel so bad for her, especially when you see what certain people in this town do to her. It's like, it's really tragic. Like, once again, it's a tragic love story. Now, there are technically a couple of villains in this story. Arguably, the two main villains of the story within the story is this witch named Rhea, who right from the very beginning has a deep hatred for Susan, and the other main villain is this character named Jonas, who ends up having a deep hatred for Roland, but I don't want to give too much away about him, but the character who I personally hated the most was Susan's aunt Cordelia. She was just a despicable human being. Like, I don't think I've ever hated a fictional character as much as Cordelia Delgado. And another thing I really liked about this, besides the whole tragic love story angle, was there was also a lot of political intrigue in this story, and in this book you really do get a sense of the politics of Midworld, at least at the time Roland was a teenager, and you really do get an idea of what it was that eventually brought about the extinction of all the gunslingers, once again with the exception of Roland. And I actually think Midworld is a pretty interesting universe, and I would actually like to see Stephen King revisit this world again in some non-Dark Tower books. Like, I know his book The Eyes of the Dragon was supposed to take place in Midworld, and also he wrote a short story that was published in his collection Everything's Eventual that was also set in Midworld, but I would like to see him write more non-Dark Tower books that just happen to take place in Midworld. I actually think it would be really cool if he wrote like a collection of short stories, each taking place in Midworld, but in different time periods of Midworld's history. But besides finding out a lot about the politics of Midworld, this book is also a great tie-in with King's novel The Stand, so if you're a fan of The Stand, you might really enjoy this. And also, this book is written in such a way where you can easily read this without having to read The Stand. However, if you've read The Stand, you would realize that this parallel universe that Roland and the rest of his Ka-Tet enter is a universe that Stephen King has visited before. Now, knowing that Randall Flagg and Walter O'Dim, or the Man in Black, were actually the same person, shows that Flagg had a hand to play in the downfall of Midworld, because in the story within the story of this book, you find out that Walter O'Dim actually worked for John Fersen, but being how powerful Flagg actually is, I have a feeling that it was actually the other way around. I have a feeling that Fersen was actually working for Flagg, however Fersen probably didn't realize that he was being controlled and manipulated by Flagg. But you also get the implication that perhaps Flagg and Fersen were actually the same person, because Flagg can change his appearance, and perhaps John Fersen was actually Randall Flagg under a different name, and perhaps wearing a different face. But that does kind of get contradicted later on in the series, and the idea of Randall Flagg and John Fersen being the same person also gets contradicted predicted in the Dark Tower comic books that Marvel did, but that also depends if you consider the comic books to be canon. Also, in this book, you get references to the Crimson King. Now, I don't want to say who or what the Crimson King actually is, but let's just say that the Crimson King ends up becoming a major character in the final 3 Dark Tower novels. But once again, Wizard and Glass is an excellent book, and it's my favorite of the Dark Tower series, and it's not just a great continuation of the Dark Tower series, but it's also a great prequel as well. It's just a great book overall, and I highly recommend this, not just if you're a Dark Tower fan, but also if you're a fan of, like, tragic love stories, and even if you're a fan of, like, teen angst stories, because most of this book takes place when Roland was a teenager. If you're a fan of, like, teen angst dramas, you might also really like this book as well. And if you're a fan of fantasy, I definitely recommend this book. But yeah, that was my review of The Dark Tower 4, Wizard and Glass by Stephen King, and bye.